Good evening and welcome to Parkland Institute's 24th annual conference, this year titled After the Contagions. My name is Trevor Harrison and I am director of the Parkland Institute. I'll shortly be introducing our opening keynote speaker for the conference, Dr. Kathryn Harrison. But first, a few notes of appreciation and thanks. Let me say first that we are thrilled to have hundreds of people joining us online this evening from across Alberta and indeed from other parts of the country. I know that many of you have long been Parkland supporters and attended our conferences in the past. And we thank you for your continued interest and support of the work we do. I want to extend a special welcome to those of you who are new to Parkland Institute and who are perhaps attending your first Parkland conference. I hope you'll find the conference stimulating and thought-provoking. While Parkland greatly appreciates support from the University of Alberta and the Faculty of Arts, we depend extensively on the support of our individual donors and our contributing organizations and unions for our funding. Any contribution you provide is given a tax receipt. We rely on your support to be able to do the work that we do, our education and research programs, and hope that you will consider making a contribution or even becoming a regular monthly donor. This, of course, is the first time we are hosting our conference virtually, so we also appreciate the technical support we are getting from the U of A Faculty of Arts Resource Center this year. We have a number of conference sponsors who I'd like to thank at this time: the Alberta Federation of Labor, Alberta Public Interest Research Group, the Athabasca University Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Canadian Union of Public Employees, Civic Service Union Local 52, the Non-Academic Staff Association at the U of A, the United Nurses of Alberta, University of Alberta's Faculty of Arts, and Wordsworth Irvine Socialist Fellowship Endowment. And a very special thanks to the Health Sciences Association of Alberta, who have sponsored the technical costs of recording our conference speakers so that we can post them on the Parkland YouTube channel for all to see. I also want to thank the media sponsors for their help in promoting our conference. Alberta Views Magazine, CJSR Radio Edmonton. Finally, I want to give a big thank you to the Parkland Board of Directors and our dedicated team of staff for all the hard work they do to keep Parkland running smoothly. We have a number of folks who will be live tweeting throughout the conference. If you'd like to join in the conversation, please use the conference hashtag #ParkConf. We have also enabled the Zoom chat feature so that participants can make comments to other attendees or to our staff who are monitoring the chat. Please note that neither I nor our speakers will be looking at the chat, but we do have staff that will be monitoring it and making sure people are being respectful. Following Kathryn's keynote talk tonight, we will open things up for questions from our conference participants. If you hover your mouse over your screen, you'll see a Q&A feature where you can write your questions. Please make your questions and comments as succinct as possible. There's also a feature where you can promote a question that you think is particularly interesting. It's my pleasure now to call upon Will Campbell to open the conference with a treaty and land recognition. Will works with many other organizations in his local community and is an elder with Native Counseling Services of Alberta. Welcome, Will.
Thank you very much. I wish to thank you, first of all, to providing protocol to Louis Cardinal for me and to recognize that we are on traditional lands of the Indigenous people. This is Treaty 6 territory, home of the Cree, the Métis, and the Inuit. I also acknowledge the people of Mother Earth and to thank those of you for your hard work and direction in making this country and this world a better place and for your continued work. My prayer is for you and for your loved ones to be blessed by the Creator in mind, body, and spirit. I will now thank the spirit world, the grandmothers and grandfathers in these 4 directions, and call upon them to guide us over this conference. So I want to thank each and every one of you for participating. How Tashina Tanka Ilhamle Ukshila Tanka Chikala Tatanka Huste. Grandfathers, grandmothers, we come in a humble way today to ask for prayers of direction, prayers of guidance, and to give thanks to the old ones for their wisdom and direction. To say a prayer for those that are suffering out there on the streets and having a hard time, and to guide us in helping them find their way back to these sacred places. I ask also for prayers for the ones that are in hospitals that are sick and having a hard time, that you take their pain, their hurt, their sickness, and you put it where it don't hurt them anymore. I ask also prayers for the 4-legged, the 2-legged, the winged creatures, those that live on the ground and swim in the water. And I ask for prayers of direction and guidance for this conference, and that you have pity on us over the next few days as we work towards making a better place for everyone. I say a prayer for Mother Earth, for everything upon her comes from her, and a prayer for each and every one of you for your loved ones and your work. Aho mitakias. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Will. I think those words will guide us throughout the days that follow in this conference. Thank you again.
Thank you.
I'd like now to invite the Interim Dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta, Dr. Steve Patton, to say a few words of welcome from the university. Steve?
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Will, for the territorial acknowledgement. It's a meaningful way to begin an event. And it's interesting with this kind of virtual event, the acknowledgement is that the University of Alberta exists on Treaty 6 territory, but I know that we are not all on Treaty 6 territory. I'm on Treaty 7 territory where I am right now, and I know some of you are unceded land in other provinces, but your words are meaningful to us all. It's a pleasure on behalf of the Faculty of Arts to welcome everyone to Parkland's 24th annual conference. The Parkland Institute has been a source of great pride for the Faculty of Arts. For over 2 decades, Parkland has provided government, academics, and the general public with critical information, the critical information they need to wade through the quagmires of modern political and economic life. The Parkland Institute is not just an academic body, it is a good public citizen. We are grateful not only for the high quality research the Institute consistently produces, but also for its contributions to informed debate and public policy discourse in this province. The Parkland Institute is collaborative and interdisciplinary, welcoming the input and participation of academics, of students, community leaders, business representatives, and unions. And we see this diversity in the range of people gathered for this virtual conference. Today, we find ourselves in a period of great uncertainty, where so much that we hold dear feels threatened. The COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, economic disruptions, and anti-democratic social movements are challenging citizens to work together and to work creatively for positive, progressive, systemic change. This conference, After the Contagions, speaks to this uncertainty and to the fundamental challenges we are facing as a country and throughout the world. Tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Kathryn Harrison, is a leading scholar of environmental policy and one who roots her academic research in a sophisticated understanding of federalism and policymaking in Canada. As a fellow political scientist, I have known Kathryn and her work for years, and I look forward to her talk this evening. As you know, Dr. Harrison joins Daniel Martin, Justice Marion Buller, Armini Yelnizyan, and Thomas Homer Dixon, who, as public intellectuals, bring a wealth of insights into where we are now and where we must go to build a more just, democratic, and sustainable future. I want to thank Trevor Harrison, Bill Moore-Kilgannon, and the entire Parkland team for organizing this impressive lineup. And I want to wish you all the best for an enjoyable conference. Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you, Steve. One of the great joys of introducing speakers at these events, which I've had the great pleasure of doing over some years now, is getting to know the people and the work that they do. Besides sharing a last name, Kathryn and I have had some conversations about whether we're long lost cousins here. I think what you'll find this evening is that we also share a good deal of interest in our academic work as well. Kathryn Harrison is a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia and an associate professor at the University of Toronto. Before entering academia, Kathryn worked as a chemical engineer in the oil industry and as a policy analyst for both Environment Canada and the United States Congress. She has published widely on Canadian and US climate and environmental policy and is currently working on a book comparing the politics of carbon taxes in Canada, Australia, France, and Ireland. Dr. Harrison's talk this evening is titled, "Is the Canadian Federation Up to the Challenge of Climate Change?" With that, no more introduction. I turn it over to you, Kathryn.
I really feel honored to have been invited to open this important conference. I'm really sorry that I'm not able to be with you in person. It really feels like we could all use that human contact right now. But because I'm not with you in person, I would like to acknowledge that my home in Vancouver is on the unceded traditional ancestral territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. The occasion is one where we are at the intersection of at least 4 crises, global crises. COVID-19, the resulting economic crisis in Canada and around the world, a long overdue reckoning with systemic racism, and of course, the climate crisis, which not only has not gone away while we've been locked in our homes, not getting out much, it's actually continued to get worse. So I'm going to focus this evening on the climate crisis. Towards the end of my talk, I'll talk a bit about how the responses to it might intersect with COVID-19 and the economic crisis. I want to start by putting Canada in the global context. This figure shows the share of global greenhouse gas emissions that each of these countries contributes. And Canada looks pretty small, where we account for about 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that's definitely dwarfed by China, the United States, India. But we are the 10th largest national greenhouse gas emitter. And in fact, those 10 emitters alone account for about 62% of global emissions. So a small number of countries contribute a lot of the emissions, and we are one of those, although we'd like to think we'd often like to think we're one of the small ones. This is taking the same countries, presenting the data a slightly different way. In this case, it is the annual emissions of each of those countries divided by the population. So this is the annual emissions per person in tons of CO2 every year. And there the picture looks quite different. We are among the highest emitting countries in the world. We're still in the top 10, but there's a group that are near the top, and then others that looked big before now look quite small. So our emissions per person are about twice those of China, more like 10 times those of India. And I included Chad because it is one of the poorest countries in the world where human lifespan is shortest. There is actually a blue line there. You just can't see it because it's about 0.1, about 150 times less than what every Canadian on average accounts for. This figure takes that data and adds one element. So the size of the circles reflects the national total emissions in each of these countries. The y-axis, the vertical axis, indicates the CO2 emissions per person. So again, Chad is down near the bottom. Saudi Arabia, US, and Canada are near the top. But in this case, they're also aligned along an x-axis, which is the GDP per capita, so a measure of the wealth of these countries. And that's an important addition because it shows us that our high per capita emissions is not accidental. We have become wealthy by burning fossil fuels and contributing greenhouse gas emissions to the global atmosphere. And that suggests that we have a special responsibility to be among those that lead in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and also that we arguably have a special responsibility to use some of that wealth to help the countries at that lower end in global income follow a cleaner development path than we did. Now let's turn to Canada and compare the emissions of provinces. This figure is, again, the total greenhouse gas emissions, not the per person ones. And you can see that the province that accounts for the greatest share of emissions is Alberta, followed by Ontario and Quebec. The 3 bars in each case indicate the total emissions in 1990, 2005, and 2018, which is the most recent year of the Canadian emissions inventory. The point I would note there is that although many provinces saw growth from 1990 to 2005, Alberta and Saskatchewan saw greater proportionate growth and have continued to grow in their emissions since then. So we have a big gap between those and also a different trajectory between those provinces and the other ones which have either leveled off or started to reduce their emissions since 2005. This is the per capita emissions by province, and 2 of these are not like the others. The emissions per person in Alberta and Saskatchewan are above 60 tons per person per year. There are no major countries in the world that have emissions that high, but there certainly are sub-regions within countries. So a state like Wyoming comes to mind, where they have emissions associated with mining coal and very few people, so quite high per capita emissions. This one looks at what's going on, and there's a lot going on in this slide. So I only want to draw your attention to a few things. The brown segments of each vertical bar indicate transportation emissions by households. Also, I think home heating is included in that. And there's some pretty big differences across provinces. That's, for the most part, reflects the population of those provinces. So Ontario and Quebec have a pretty big brown bar because there's a lot of people getting around in vehicles and heating their homes in those provinces. The next 2 that I would want to draw your attention to are the orange bars and the gray ones. The orange bars are emissions associated with mining and oil and gas production, and that is clearly accounts for why the per capita emissions in Alberta are as high as they are. And then the gray ones is the emissions associated primarily with electricity production. So Alberta and Saskatchewan have had a double whammy, production of oil and gas on a large scale for export. This is no news to you. And also heavy reliance on fossil fuels for electricity production, which has not been as prominent in places like British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, where they've had access to hydroelectric power. So far, when I talked about Canada, we have seen some similarities with the global picture, big differences in total emissions among provinces as we've had among countries globally, big differences in per capita emissions within Canada as we see globally. That said, there's nothing sacred about analyzing Canada's emissions in terms of regions or provinces. We could have done it in terms of emissions for different income levels, emissions by gender, emissions by sector. But in the Canadian context, region and provinces loom large for a couple of reasons. One of them is the size of the country and thus the diversity of the resources that people have relied on to build those regional economies. But the other is that we have a federal system of government that creates provinces as political actors who have independent authority to act within their jurisdiction on certain topics that are allocated to them, just as the federal government does. So we tend to think about things in terms of the provinces and federal provincial relations when we talk about environmental policy and many other areas of policy in Canada. Federalism is a subject that political scientists love to talk about because it's a really complicated machine, and how federalism impacts policy, I think, differs across policy areas. I'm going to focus obviously on environment and climate, and even there's some pretty big disagreements about federalism. The column on the left, best of both worlds, indicates some of the strengths that having a federal system would bring to environmental policy. The fact that subnational governments, provinces, or in the US case, states, can act on environmental policy means that they can tailor responses to the unique problems that those regions face, and also adopt policies that reflect the preferences of their own voters. So in some locations, voters may be more concerned, more willing to forego economic activity in pursuit of a cleaner environment, and others less so. And having provincial autonomy in that area can make everybody happier than having consistent national standards. The next argument is that provinces, 10 heads are better than one, that they can serve as laboratories of democracy by coming up with new approaches to public policy. They innovate, and then other provinces can learn from the innovations that have worked. Finally, so far I've been talking just about the provinces, but it is normally the case in federations, and certainly in Canada's federation, that the federal government and the provinces have overlapping authority. And there it's often argued that federalism allows us to have the best of both worlds, that the federal government and the provinces can coordinate their roles in a way that we take advantage of each one's strengths. So the federal government might regulate products that are sold everywhere in the country, like motor vehicle emissions. They can address spillovers across borders, engage in international negotiations, and possibly set minimum national standards, whereas the provinces can address local matters, potentially, if citizens want it, have stronger standards than the minimum national standards, reflecting those local preferences. So that's kind of the ideal. The column to the right is what can go wrong. Rather than provinces just doing their own thing independently, maybe the preference of residents of one province is that they can have economic activity by allowing the wind to blow the emissions, or a stream to carry the effluent into another jurisdiction where it's not their problem. Rather than being laboratories of democracy, provinces or states may be engaged in economic competition such that they are reluctant to regulate local industries lest they hinder the competitiveness and job creation within their borders. You know, it's sometimes described as a race to the bottom among provinces. I actually think it's very hard to find examples of an out and out race to the bottom. What is much more common is stuck at the status quo. They're not trying to undermine each other. Jurisdictions may be reluctant to act alone lest they hinder the competitiveness of their local industry. And finally, to the extent that the federal and provincial governments have overlapping authority, lots of different things could happen. If they're acting independently, they may be pointing at each other and saying, it's not my responsibility, it's theirs. They may be fighting and obstructing each other's policies. To the extent they're coordinating and agreeing to cooperate, we may see what's referred to as the joint decision trap. If there's an ideal that we all have to agree, then that's most valuable for the jurisdiction at the lowest common denominator. They can say no to everything else and block progress. So what have we got in practice in the Canadian Federation when it comes to environmental policy? As in other federations, those who were writing, the fathers, and they were men of Confederation, weren't thinking about environmental policy. The word environment does not appear in Canada's constitution, let alone climate. So what happens is governments and the courts try to find what authority related to environmental protection is associated with the words that are in the Constitution. Starting with the provinces have quite substantial authority as owners of Crown resources. So as the government that controls lands that are still in public hands, I would like to acknowledge that particularly in my home province where there were no treaties negotiated, the ownership of those lands is contested. Most of Canada's landmass is still considered Crown resources, and the provinces in their borders control those resources, not only the land, but in almost all cases, the subsurface minerals, even if the ground itself was alienated. And that means the provinces are owners of the fossil fuels. Provinces also have extensive authority with respect to property and civil rights, basically the ability to make laws that apply within their own provinces. And the only limitation really is that they can't pass laws that have an impact beyond their own borders. So if the effluent is flowing into one province, the receiving province can't do anything about it. They can't control a source outside their borders. The federal government doesn't have as extensive a proprietary rights except in the Northern Territories, but they have a number of so-called heads of power that give them legislative authority to act. Some of the heads of powers that sound very narrow have actually been very important in environmental policy. The fisheries power for many decades was used as the major source of federal authority to control water pollution, navigation and shipping, interprovincial works and undertakings, that's the pipeline power. Federal government has authority with respect to interprovincial and international trade and commerce. Criminal law, that's the basis for federal regulation of toxic substances under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. The spending power, that one I've got in quotation marks because it doesn't actually exist as such. It's not mentioned in the Constitution. What the federal government does have is unlimited authority to raise money through taxes. And the courts have accepted that if they have the authority to raise that money, they can spend it. And the federal government has often used that money, its power of the purse, to convince provinces to play along. And that's how we got Medicare in this country. And the final one, and this is one that's pretty contentious these days with respect to climate, is the residual power to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Canada. So if a topic is not listed in either the federal list or the provincial list, in theory, it belongs to the federal government. In practice, the courts historically have interpreted that property and civil rights power of the provinces very broadly and been quite reluctant to turn to the peace, order, and good government power. So there's a lot of uncertainty, more uncertainty about federal powers than there is about provincial authority. When we talk about climate, and in particular, the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, important to note that although there is a reference to empire treaties that were negotiated on Canada's behalf by Great Britain, there is no treaty power in Canada's constitution that would give the federal government right by virtue of having negotiated a treaty. If there is conflict between a province and the federal government, the feds win. In practice, that hasn't been an issue in environmental policy because if one level of government wants to set higher standards than the other, that's not a conflict. It's possible for a private sector actor to comply with both. That's the backdrop. What have we seen over the decades? And I'll start way back in ancient history when I was a young child, and how before we turn to climate policy, there have definitely been periods of conflict between the federal government and the provinces over environmental policy. The late 60s, when the federal government passed its first environmental laws, amendments to the Fisheries Act, the Canada Water Act. Some of the smaller provinces welcomed federal involvement, but the bigger ones were offended by the federal government, presuming that they couldn't take care of this problem themselves. That's the Old Man River Dam, which will be familiar to Albertans. It reflects a second period of conflict in the late 80s. That was a time when the federal government introduced the Canadian Environmental Protection Act over the objections of, again, some but not all provinces. That was a case of the federal government asserting authority unilaterally. The big disputes during this period were not because the federal government intended to cause conflict, but rather that the way they had written their environmental assessment regulation included the word shall at the time. And environmental groups sued the federal government to force it to perform environmental assessments, including of provincial government's own projects like the Old Man River Dam. And that was a source of conflict, not because the provinces wanted to be the ones to protect the environment so much as that the federal government could be constraining the provincial government's authority to exploit their natural resources for economic growth. That said, most of the time, the federal government and the provinces have gotten along. Up until the late 60s, the federal government simply deferred to the provinces. Between the early 70s and the late 80s, There was a return to cooperation through bilateral agreements between the federal government and the provinces, so-called one window agreements, the premise of which is only one level of government should be dealing with polluters. It was always the province, and the federal government agreed that it would be up to the provinces to implement their own environmental laws as well as any federal laws. In practice, the federal government just backed off and essentially withdrew from the field, didn't pass very many regulations, and didn't step in even when provinces didn't implement those regulations. And then after the conflicts over environmental assessment, the federal government amended its environmental assessment regulation, and the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment pursued something called the Harmonization Initiative. And the idea there was to establish consensus standards as a basis for moving forward. And it was a senior official in Alberta's Intergovernmental Affairs Unit that explained to me, in the wake of that, those court cases over Old Man River Dam, among others, was if a guy moves into your house and you can't get rid of him, you at least want to keep him in the basement. So from Alberta's and many others' perspective at this point, the idea was to establish joint decision-making, Canada-wide standards that required consensus of the federal government and the provinces, rather than letting the federal government run amok unilaterally. Not a lot of innovation. Actually, most of this period, Canada got any new ideas from the US and mimicked what the US was doing. Some brief periods of conflict when the environment was a hot issue for voters, and that meant both the federal government and provinces were keen to do something. But most of the time they've gotten along, and what we've seen prevail is buck passing in one direction from the federal government to the provinces, and when that wasn't enough, tying up the federal government through a joint decision trap. And so I guess a couple points I'd make before I turn more specifically to climate policy in more recent years is that we tend to think of cooperation as a great thing. But in fact, in this case, federal-provincial cooperation was not a signal of a shared commitment to getting the best of both worlds, but rather a reflection that neither was particularly keen to move forward, and they were happy to step back, stop fighting, leave it to the provinces. And intergovernmental harmony is not the end in and of itself. In fact, it may go with environmental protection, or it may go with the opposite, backing off. What about climate policy? Very similar pattern until 2015. In the 1990s, it wasn't just the environment ministers meeting, they were also meeting with the energy ministers and seeking consensus. So again, that strategy of keeping the federal government in the basement. Somewhere here, I've got a quote from Sheila Copps, who was the federal environment minister during this period, starting in '93, it became clear that the rule of federal provincial consensus in the environmental agenda would mean moving to the lowest common denominator. So a decade of talking, but not getting anything done. There were 3 weeks of federal provincial squabbling in late November, early December of 1997. And that's when the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated. The federal government and provinces had agreed on a target. The federal government went a little bit beyond it. The provinces were very mad. There were stories that provincial officials wouldn't get in the elevator at the conference center in Kyoto with federal officials. But in fact, the day after that Kyoto meeting ended, harmony was restored, or at least we were well on our way. The prime minister said, don't worry, we're not necessarily going to ratify this treaty. We will commit to a fair distribution of costs that doesn't harm any province. And in fact, they launched something called the National Climate Change Process, and it was co-chaired by the province of Alberta and the federal government. Hundreds of federal, provincial officials and stakeholders flew around the country for 4.5 years talking and never reached agreement on a plan. We then had another little period, 6 months of disagreement in 2002, when Prime Minister Chrétien announced that Canada would ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And even the 2 provinces that supported ratification joined all the other provinces and territories in objecting to the federal government releasing its own plan rather than a joint plan. although there wasn't one. There was no joint plan that had been agreed to at this point. Again, a return to cooperation in various forms for more than a decade. Despite ratification, the federal government did very little, and eventually, under the Conservatives, Stephen Harper withdrew Canada from the Kyoto Protocol. There were a few things. Canada adopted tailpipe emission standards that matched US standards. It actually would have been more costly for the Canadian auto industry not to mimic the US standards. There was a weak power plant regulation that basically wouldn't take effect before any existing power plant was scheduled for retirement. During this period, we saw innovation by some provinces and leadership. Ontario closed its coal-fired power plants. Quebec and briefly Ontario joined in emissions trading with California. British Columbia adopted a revenue neutral carbon tax. Alberta had its SGR regulation. I'm not including it here because it asked too little of industry. It was essentially protecting the reputation of the industry without achieving meaningful reductions beyond what they would have done anyway. One of the challenges during this period is there were provincial leaders, but there weren't any followers. So the provinces that didn't want to take as equally aggressive action just didn't. And the federal government did not step in. And then we get to 2015 and the landscape really changed at that point. And there were three underlying conditions or developments that created that fundamental change in 2015. The first was the election of an NDP government in Alberta and its adoption of the climate leadership plan in that province. That included revisions to carbon pricing for large industrial sources, a commitment to phase out coal-fired power by 2030, extending carbon pricing to households, so a carbon tax on building, heating, and transportation, a number of other things. This picture at the bottom is one that I have seen on many people's walls in Alberta when I've been in your province doing research. This moment agreement among Indigenous leaders, environmentalists, industry, and of course the provincial government. A key thing I would note is that the Leach committee that devised that plan made a choice that Alberta should be price competitive with other jurisdictions, not emissions target competitive. And that's a hugely important foundation of that plan, that Alberta would match BC's carbon price of $30 per ton, but not the emissions reductions target that various provinces had. And that meant that under the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan, the expectation was that Alberta's emissions would continue to go up until they leveled off in 2030. The second condition in 2015 for change was the election of a federal Liberal government. The Liberals under Justin Trudeau had promised a couple of things. One of them was carbon pricing, but they didn't say what the price would be. But they did say it would be done in partnership with the provinces. If provinces had already acted, the federal government wanted to work with them, which was quite reassuring to some provincial governments and many voters. They also promised to get Canada's resources to market, a thinly veiled reference to approving at least one pipeline. And the third thing was at the end of 2015, COP21 was coming up in Paris. The goal was that the successor international agreement to the Kyoto Protocol would be negotiated at COP21 in December 2015. Canada rejoined the international negotiations to much applause. And there was fairly easy federal provincial agreement. Here they all are smiling, making the Vancouver Declaration that Canada's target would be a 30% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. Now, it's a very ambitious target, but it's one that the Harper Conservative government had already established before the elections. Not so controversial. A year later, in December 2016, the federal government and all provinces but Saskatchewan, I can't see all their faces there in this little picture, but there they are, happy again, a year later. And they had negotiated what is called the Pan-Canadian Framework. And this is the closest thing we've seen to that best of both worlds scenario, trying to identify what are the things the provinces are best at, what are the things that the feds are best at, and work together to achieve a common goal, in this case, Canada's Paris Agreement 2030 target. Provincial actions, provincial commitments included taking the lead in carbon pricing, building codes, building transit, urban design, a number of other things within the provinces. But the Pan-Canadian framework included a much bolder role for the federal government than we have ever seen before in Canadian climate policy or environmental policy. A number of big federal regulations, tighter standards for motor vehicles. Again, that one was just matching what the US was doing under the Obama administration. Methane targets, federal regulations there, matching Alberta's commitment to phase out coal-fired power by 2030, proposal for a federal clean fuel standard, which remains to be finalized still today. The controversial thing was that the federal government asserted a carbon pricing backstop, that if provinces did not match the carbon price, starting at $20 per ton in 2018, getting to $50 per ton in 2022, that should say, then the federal government would step in. Now, provinces had a choice to either do that via a carbon tax within their borders, or to establish an emissions trading scheme that would deliver the same emissions reductions that would have been achieved by a carbon tax. So there's this moment, look at them all happy and clapping, but in fact, there was some pretty ugly politics before that Pan-Canadian framework was agreed. Here we've got Justin Trudeau in his pugilistic mode, critical to getting agreement in December of 2016 was a threat that the Prime Minister made that fall that was very explicit. If the provinces don't do carbon pricing, the federal government would step in. As we'll get to, the federal government also followed through on that. The other thing was the deal between the federal government and Alberta. Alberta had only committed to establishing a carbon price as high as $30 per ton. Alberta's consent to going as far as $50 per ton in 2022 was conditional on the federal government's approval of the Trans Mountain Expansion project. Basically, Alberta's climate leadership plan became the template for the national plan. And that is a problem in the sense that Alberta's plan was based on being price competitive, will match other jurisdictions' price, and the federal government, built in a fixed price. But the fact is, Canada had signed on to an emissions reductions target by 2030, as had the provinces, and $50 per ton is nowhere high enough to get us there. So they were all happy for a couple of years, and then in 2018, it all started to unravel. There they are, the resistance, an infamous cover of Maclean's of conservative politicians in blue suits, the federal then leader and provincial premiers who opposed the federal government's carbon pricing strategy. Saskatchewan had never agreed to be part of this carbon pricing plan. And in fact, that's why the federal government had proposed a carbon tax rather than an emissions trading scheme, because they thought they would only have to do it in one province. And Saskatchewan wasn't big enough with enough sources to establish an emissions trading scheme. But in quick succession, everything changed. Ontario had a change in the conservative leader as a result of a sex scandal. Doug Ford came in and changed the Conservative Party from supporting cap and trade to opposing it. When the Conservatives won, Ontario withdrew from emissions trading with Quebec and California. The federal government then ruled that the Manitoba and New Brunswick plans that the provinces had submitted for review did not meet the federal benchmarks for carbon pricing. A year later, Alberta eliminated its carbon tax after the provincial election saw a turnover to the UCP. And suddenly we have the federal government imposing a carbon tax in 5 provinces across the country. What does that look like? Well, there's 2 parts. There is the output-based pricing for industry. I'm not going to talk a lot about the industry scheme, other than to say that it is separable from the household carbon price. For households, There was a carbon tax on individuals, on small businesses, a commitment by the federal government that all money would be returned to the province of origin. 90% of that went to households, the other 10% to small business, local governments. And that was done via a tax credit called the Climate Action Incentive. It was the same for households of equal size and a little bit of a bump. I think it's 20% for rural households. The fact that the federal government was giving all the money back did not undermine the efficacy of this policy. The purpose of a carbon tax is to establish a price incentive for firms or individuals to reduce their consumption of fossil fuels or switch to different products or different processes that use less fossil fuels. The purpose is not to raise money. And as long as the money's being returned separately via an equal tax credit for every person, every individual still has that incentive. They can save money by buying a more fuel efficient vehicle or an electric vehicle, and they still get their money back. They still get their share of the money back in their taxes. So the tax rebate does not undermine the price incentive, which is a source of a lot of confusion. These are figures from the Parliamentary Budget Office. It's an independent, nonpartisan body that calculated the household costs of carbon pricing before rebates. It's pretty complicated. Let's compare just the goldish colored ones. So you can see that in 2019-20, the average household in Saskatchewan would pay $400 per year in carbon taxes. That'd go up to about $900 per year in 23-24. New Brunswick at the other end, it would be more like $200 per year for the average household, going up to about $400 a few years later. So big variation in how much households are paying because of those differences in carbon intensity, but also big variation in how much money everybody gets back. This is from the same PBO report. This was done before the federal carbon tax applied in Alberta. So that's why it's only got these 4 provinces. Let's look just at the first 1, 2, 3, 5 bars for Saskatchewan. What that is telling us is that the households with the lowest 20% of income on balance get more money back than they are paying. So they're ahead by $70. The next quintile is ahead by about $50. So basically 80% of households get more money back than they're paying. And only that final quintile is it positive. And even they in 2019-20 were paying under $50 per ton. So a similar pattern across provinces. Most households got more money back than they were paying. And that's because the wealthiest households use a lot of fossil fuels. The result of this federal plan, where it was up to provinces in the first instance, resulted in a true patchwork of policies. We've got provinces like Newfoundland and British Columbia with their own carbon taxes. We've got 2 provinces with emissions trading schemes. We've got provinces imposing the carbon tax. The federal government deals with industry, and provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, where the province deals with the industrial emissions and the federal government applies a carbon tax. And there's all kinds of other differences across these provinces in terms of coverage and subsidies for industry and so on. What did voters think of it? This figure shows the results from survey research I did with Matto Mildenberger, Eric LaChapelle. We surveyed the same group of Canadians, ending up with about 250 in each province. We talked to them 4 different times in 5 provinces: BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Quebec. We'd expect differences because those provinces have different approaches to carbon pricing. Only Saskatchewan and Ontario were subject to the federal carbon tax. And the reason we talked to them multiple times is there were key moments in implementation. So in February, people knew a federal carbon tax was coming in those provinces. In April, it had been implemented. By wave 3 in July, everyone had their rebates, and then we had the federal election. What we expected to see in Ontario, which is green, and Saskatchewan, which is blue, is that there would be a jump in public support when people got their money back. but there isn't. There's kind of a gradual trend in Saskatchewan, but even then, it still ends up with very strong majority opposition to the federal carbon tax. So we're like, why didn't giving people more money back than they were spending build popular support? Well, it's because of, in recent years, conservative politicians' opposition. They made the same arguments that we've seen in many other countries, that we saw in British Columbia, that carbon taxes don't work. This is actually not true, that it's unfair to you in some way because you live in a rural community, because you're low income, because you're hardworking. We'd all like to believe that somebody else is causing this problem, or that it could be solved only by industry. They emphasized the most salient aspect, which was the impact on gasoline prices. And in the middle picture, you see Andrew Scheer, who tweeted out an image of himself putting gas in his vehicle the day the federal carbon tax took effect. He was joined by politicians across the country and by frontbenchers of the federal Conservatives, arguments that you can't trust the government. The final picture on the right there is a sticker that the Ford government in Ontario required that gas stations put on the pumps across the province, that gave the misleading impression that the carbon tax was going to go up infinitely and that it was a greater share of price increases, and also conveniently ignored the money that people were getting back. When we drill down, what we see is huge differences in support depending on political party that the individual supports. So looking at Saskatchewan, you see that Liberals in Saskatchewan, although they're kind of few and far between, had strong support for the federal carbon tax. Conservatives, it was at times down in single digits, a difference of a factor of 8 at times between Conservatives and Liberals in Saskatchewan. Big differences in Ontario, although not quite so great. We also see that Conservatives have less accurate information about their rebates. So in Ontario, this is all citizens. 61% of respondents underestimated how much money they got back in their tax rebates, compared to 14% who overestimated. Even bigger difference in Saskatchewan. 75% of respondents underestimated how much money they were getting back. So that was true of all parties, but Conservatives underestimated their rebates by more than Liberals. In Saskatchewan, they estimated that they got a family rebate on average of $276 for Conservatives, $340 for Liberals. The reality is $434. In Ontario, the differences aren't quite as great, but the same pattern. Conservatives underestimate how much they're getting back by the most. So we thought, well, maybe people didn't realize it's called the climate incentive. The line in the tax return doesn't say anything about climate change or the carbon tax, doesn't say anything about the carbon tax. So we thought, well, we divided up our sample in Saskatchewan and Ontario. We gave half of them a copy of what their tax rebate schedule would look like, because we knew whether they were married, how many kids they have, whether they lived in a rural or urban area. So we know exactly how much money they got back, and we showed them that. And the other half, we didn't. And we found that people did adjust. They had somewhat more accurate perceptions of how much money they were getting back. Although Conservatives adjusted by less, they were still wrong by more, but it didn't affect their support for the policy. And so what we've seen is this isn't just about values. People have wrong information. They have been misled that they're not getting money back or that they're paying more. They have incorrect information about how the policy worked. As a result, the majority of Canadians in those 5 provinces opposed a policy that was actually putting money in their own pockets. That's not the only thing that Canadians are misinformed about. There's virtual unanimity among scientists that climate change is caused by human activity. This figure shows the percent of adults who think the Earth is getting warmer primarily because of human activity. Even in areas where it's green, the percents are down in the 60s. And in Alberta and Saskatchewan, it's below 50%. Voters have misinformation, and it tends to align with province. We've now got court challenges, provincial governments that are have gone to court to say that the federal carbon tax is unconstitutional. So far, the feds are 2 for 1. They won in Ontario and Saskatchewan. They lost in Alberta. And in September, the Supreme Court held a hearing. We haven't had the decision yet. The big issue is not the tax power. The federal government isn't relying on its unlimited power to tax because they gave the money back. So it's not a tax. The real question is, can the peace order and good government sustain the carbon pricing scheme? Provincial governments, not all of them. BC actually intervened in favor of the federal carbon tax, but the provinces that oppose it argued that this is so broad reaching that it will destroy the fabric of our federation. Those supporting it have argued that provinces alone cannot solve a problem like climate change, and argued that the federal government, by waiting for provinces to act in the first instance, has been cautious, has defined its area of intervention in a way that is a distinct issue consistent with the way courts have interpreted peace order and good government. Courts tend to be very reluctant to go to peace order and good government because of that potential to disrupt the balance in the federation. And that's a huge issue in this case because carbon emissions come from everything that we are doing. If the federal government loses, I will despair, not because I think carbon taxes are the only policy that can work. I don't even think it's the only policy we should have. It's that we will have lost by then 7 years, probably more. Then there will be time to develop a new approach. Would federal regulations of individual sectors, they'd have to start with oil and gas. Could they survive? There will be constitutional challenges there as well. So it's a quite precarious position right now for the Federation and for national climate policy. Before I close, a few reflections on the COVID and economic crises. How did it impact? Well, one negative possibility is that COVID has displaced the climate change from top of mind for Canadians. And we've certainly seen big impacts. If you ask people what's the single most important issue, if you ask them what the top 3 issues are, there's climate change is mentioned by the same percent of people. We added a 5th wave to our survey in May and found no change in support for climate policy, so actual actions. We did test competing narratives. So one suggestion has been that we can talk about climate policy in the same ways as we talk about COVID, that we need to flatten the curve of exponential growth, or we have to act together on COVID, and in the same way, we need to act together to solve the climate crisis. We presented a fraction of respondents with those narratives, and it had remarkably little impact, which was surprising and disappointing. I think the potential for something positive lies in public spending that combines recovery from COVID, a just recovery, and a green recovery, the idea of building back better. It's a good idea. Building back worse, or a brown recovery, is obviously a terrible idea. I think the rhetoric of a Green New Deal is a little more problematic in Canada than it is in the US, not just because it's been associated with the NDP at the federal level, but because the workers who are seeking and arguably deserve a just transition in the fossil fuel industry are actually better paid on average than taxpayers else in other regions and in other sectors. So I think that one will be complicated. My worries about public spending is that we're not going to buy our way out of climate change with taxpayers' dollars. And what worries me is we are seeing governments delaying implementation of regulations, taking a step back on oversight of regulatory compliance, even as they're throwing money at not just clean industries, but in some cases, carbon intensive industries. It is also the case that whenever there are deficits that need to be resolved, we can expect a period of federal provincial conflict. So to conclude, Canada faces very similar challenges as we have seen at the international level. There are some regions that are more vulnerable, yet contributed almost nothing to emissions. So think of the Canadian territories. The impacts of climate change are double their share of Canada's emissions are tiny. Emissions intensive jurisdictions resist change. And we've seen that countries on the international stage, and we've seen it among provinces within the Canadian Federation. And countries are reluctant to act alone. Provincial governments are reluctant to act alone. The Canadian federalism, I think, has exacerbated Canada's failure to take meaningful action on climate change. I don't put everything on federalism. I think it's a marginal effect and it's a negative one. The provinces defend their economies, and in many cases, those economies are predicated on provincially owned fossil fuels. The federal government has continued a pattern until recently of deferring to the provinces, other than brief periods where the environment's a hot issue. We have seen the joint decision trap time and again, and we have seen a combination of partisans and provincial opponents, which have tended to overlap in recent years, deploy rhetorical strategies that are simply misleading voters. They're giving them inaccurate or incomplete information and offering fake alternatives, which we've seen certainly in the federal election. The big difference, and I think it's a really important one, is that there isn't such a thing as a world government. The countries of the world can only act together voluntarily by committing to link arms. Canada is a country with potential for the federal government to play a critical role, not the only role. This idea that we have to seek consensus, it is a norm. It's not a constitutional requirement. And I think we've seen very promising changes there in the last few years, but a lot is going to turn on that Supreme Court decision. And we're in a minority government situation at the federal government, whether there's a change in government with the next election. And with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to take any and all questions.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. That was a stimulating and really interesting discussion. We will be taking questions here. I just want to remind people that to send your questions to the Q&A feature, not to chat. If you hover your mouse over the screen, you'll see the Q&A feature where you can write your questions. Please make them again as succinct as possible, given the time. There's also a feature where you can promote a question if you think it's particularly interesting. We already have a couple of questions here. I want, first of all, actually to thank Linda McFarland, who did ask a question that I think actually, after she asked it, I think you've adequately answered it, but how do you think the Supreme Court will rule on the Fed's right to impose a price on carbon? The second question that has come in here, an anonymous attendee here, how will the GHG picture change if and when methane emissions are factored in?
Well, there was a publication just last week by federal public servants that found that methane emissions are actually higher than double what we thought they were in Western provinces, at least. I think the implication is that our emissions probably have always been higher. Canada looks worse on the international stage. We have slightly bigger reductions that need to be made, but much bigger reductions to get to net zero in 2050.
There's another question here I'm going to go to, and partly it's because I'm going to add my part of a question to it. From Ahmed Safar, can you please elaborate on why the Green New Deal is more problematic in Canada? And you've answered some of that, but will the results in the US elections affect that? And so one of the questions I had in mind is, what do you think the impact of a Joe Biden presidency will have, both in terms of relations in dealing with these things, but also more practically on policy on environment?
I think the premise of the Green New Deal in the US is that low-income communities are those that are most impacted by emissions, will be most affected by efforts to reduce emissions. And I'm just not sure that it will play out the same way in Canada, where going with NPRI data, National Pollutant Release Inventory data, not CO2, the communities that have the highest emissions tended to be at the median average income. It's not necessarily the poorest communities, although I think they're Indigenous communities that are in a very different situation. Also, this question of just transition could be more politically challenging if the workers who are seeking compensation have been earning 50% more than counterparts with equal education in other provinces. Effective the US election, the Biden administration will be back in the Paris Agreement by the end of February, and that's a huge deal. Everyone, including Canada, has put on a brave face and said, we're going to continue on without them, but having the second largest emitter and the biggest economy in the world out of the deal made everything harder. It's easier for Canada to tighten regulations and to raise our carbon price that the US will be moving forward, because Canadian industry always screams if Canada's standards are more demanding than their counterparts south of the border are facing. Now, the way that carbon pricing was designed does provide a lot of protection for industry, perhaps more than they need, but it still would be politically valuable for them to argue, well, if the US isn't acting, we shouldn't either. We can expect to see tighter emission standards for motor vehicles, big US investments in clean tech, and moving away, tightening the standards and possibly zero emission vehicle standards, which pose big questions for demand for Canada's oil in the single market that has accounted for 80% of our production. I think it's likely that Biden will say no to the Keystone XL pipeline. Big chill for the Canadian oil industry. In other respects, it makes it easier for Canada to act as we normally have in lockstep with the US in addressing climate change.
Thank you. I have a question here from Elizabeth Smythe. She asks, are there other federations that have done better to dealing with climate policy? And if so, why? And perhaps just as an addendum to that, if you were to sort of target maybe 2 or 3 very specific policy solutions that you think actually would make a real difference right now, and maybe we've seen examples of that elsewhere.
The European Union is a quasi-federation. When it comes, there are individual countries, but when it comes to climate, they act as one. I think the federal dynamic has been very positive there early on. Some of the biggest member states were aggressively pushing for stronger climate action, and they were very generous in terms of bringing along lower income states. And that it set the bar higher in the European Union. They've also moved forward with some EU-wide measures. And I think the 2 key differences why quasi-federal nature of the EU has been positive on balance in comparison to Canada is first that the biggest member states were relatively green. Early on, both the UK and Germany had seen emissions reductions for reasons unrelated to climate change, but they ceded those reductions to the community rather than asking to be paid for them. And so that was a big deal. And the other is they don't make decisions on climate policy by consensus. They have a weighted majority vote. Things would be very different in the Canadian Federation if we didn't always try to get consensus, which we're not actually required to do. We just like the idea of getting along. It's so Canadian, but it's about as Canadian as failing for 3 decades to act on climate change. What do we need to do? I think that many of the policies, the architecture that we need is there. We just need to ramp up the ambition. We need more demanding regulations. We need a higher carbon price. And if we don't want to do it through carbon pricing, it's going to cost us more to do it through regulation. We need to ramp up zero emission vehicle mandates. Quebec apparently announced today that they will phase out sale of gas-powered vehicles by 2035. I think we can do that and probably even sooner.
Thank you. Question here from a good friend of Parkland, Jim Byrne. How much of the federal case to the Supreme Court argues that climate urgency, the crisis, outweighs any loss of federal unity, for lack of a better word? In other words, how much is the federal case based on recognizing the urgency of climate change as defined by the science?
Hi, Jim. Jim and I know each other. Under the peace order and good government power, there are different interpretations. One of them is like new issues no one knew about, like nuclear power. Another one is the national emergency power. They didn't rely on the emergency power because it's temporary. And we're in this for the long haul. And then the third one is the national concern doctrine, where the federal government has to establish that its actions meet singleness, distinctiveness, and indivisibility. And there's also a provincial inability issue there. I think what we've seen at the Federal Court of Appeal level, I sort of watched the live cast of the Supreme Court, is that it's very clear judges get how serious this is and how urgent it is. I found the Saskatchewan and Ontario interpretations quite creative, and it's almost as if the judges wanted to find a way forward within the Canadian Federation. I don't think if the Supreme Court justices are motivated by urgency that it will be explicit. I think what we're seeing is that they're looking for a way to make this work because they get it, that they get the urgency.
Question from Doug Megaston. Do you think that the TMX pipeline is essentially settled? The question of that at this point.
I think we will probably see some more civil disobedience. The big question there is scale of Indigenous resistance and whether we see solidarity resistance across the country as emerged in the case of the Wet'suwet'en resistance to the gas pipeline in northern BC. So that's one area of uncertainty. I think the bigger question is the market, like how long there will be a market for operation of that pipeline. I suspect it will be built.
A question here from Lindsay McLaren. Are you able to explain or comment on the importance of recent youth climate change lawsuits? I believe there's at least one in BC that was dismissed in the federal courts.
Mm-hmm. It breaks my heart that young people are going to court asking for their right to a safe and healthy future. I think it's a long shot legally. We haven't seen a lot of success in the US. Some people may have seen celebrating something going on in Ontario was that the court indicated they were willing to hear the case, not that they had decided the case in favor of youth. So who knows? I think it's a desperate action because we are at the stage of desperate actions.
Question from an anonymous attendee again. Your presentation didn't address the role of renewables at all. How do you see the subsidizing of renewable energy in reducing the acute GHG emissions? And if I can just throw in here maybe a side question that if I understand correctly, California is the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world, and they're very rapidly moving away from gas-driven cars. What effect do you think that is going to have? So both renewables and this move to electrical vehicles.
I mean, I think the US election results had big implications for California's ability to push the US forward. Under the US Clean Air Act, California can only set more demanding standards than the US federal government if they get approval from the federal government. They had approval from the Obama administration, then the Trump EPA withdrew that approval. Now it's in court, but it was never resolved. A Biden administration will come in, renew California's waiver, and California will push the US forward. Biden was involved in negotiating a new round of emission standards for motor vehicles after the global financial crisis when he was vice president. The federal government gave a bailout to the auto companies contingent on them agreeing to these much more demanding tailpipe standards. And I expect we will see a return to that as well. And the implications of both of those strategies and the increasing popularity of zero emission vehicle mandates is that consumption of gasoline will decline. Canada should be ready for that. We're still driving all out towards a cliff. And either the world fails to address climate change and we just all go off the cliff together, or they act on climate change and we drive off the cliff alone. It doesn't make sense. Renewables, personally, I would rather not subsidize renewals and just make fossil fuels more expensive, which has the same impact. I think we are at a moment of green stimulus, economic stimulus, and putting money into renewables makes more sense than putting money into fossil fuels.
I'm going to take one last question here. And fortunately, this one actually follows really nicely on that. It's from Anahia Johnson. How much does Alberta and Canada spend on subsidizing oil and gas? And what would removing these subsidies do for green initiatives?
I don't know the number. And it was one of those things I meant to look up before my talk today. I mean, it is contested. What counts as a subsidy? Does the federal government buying a pipeline constitute a subsidy? Technically, there are people who argue it wouldn't. I think it's a, $12 billion subsidy. One of the things the Biden administration is likely to do is for the US to use its economic power to push for phasing out subsidies. And Canada is one of the worst countries in the world in terms of the amount we subsidize fossil fuels relative to the scale of our economy, and that would make a huge difference. I don't see Canadian governments doing it unless they're pushed from outside, because they've been saying they were gonna for a really long time. If there's anything that is good politics, it's handing out money.
And certainly, though, interesting enough, as conservative politicians will sometimes say, they always just want a level playing field. Well, getting rid of subsidies would actually achieve that.
It would. There's someone else's level and there's our level.
Kathryn, I want to thank you for an absolutely wonderful and stimulating talk this evening. I think you've launched our 24th annual conference in a quite wonderful way. I look forward to the rest of the week. For those of you who've only registered for tonight but want to take in other conference speakers or the Alberta Solutions panel on Saturday, you can still register for that online up until noon on the day of the event. We'll also be sending out the Zoom link for each event in the afternoon of the event, so please watch in your inboxes for that. I want to give thanks to the generous support of HSAA. They will be able to post a video of our keynote speakers on our Parkland YouTube page. So if you know anyone who didn't make it tonight, please alert them to that. In closing, I'd like to note that the research we do is really dependent upon the support that we receive from all of you. If you are sending out have a survey questions or any questions or comments you'd like to make with regards to the conference, please forward those on to us as well. And finally, I'd like to remind you that if you're joining tomorrow night, our speaker for the evening is Dr. Danielle Martin, the founder of Doctors for Medicare. In the meantime, thank you for attending. Good night, have a great evening, and we will be seeing you again. Take care. Bye now.